по Евразии, организации.
I'm pleased to welcome everyone. Before we start our program this morning, I would like to thank the Kazakhstan government for a warm welcome and for the opportunity to have this session as part of the Astana Economic Forum. And I want to thank Kazakhstan for its support to OECD work, not only Kazakhstan, but throughout the region. And this morning we are going to discuss the project that covers not only Kazakhstan, but Central Asia as well. We highly value this assistance, and I can say that the governments of the neighboring countries also value your support. Like many here know, Kazakhstan is the most active and the major partner in the region. Last year, we completed the second stage of the country program. We have signed the memorandum to continue with our cooperation. And today, we are going to present you with the result of two projects. The first part will be dedicated to the labor productivity issues, which is one of the key challenges facing Kazakhstan. And the second part will be dedicated to the trade transport links in Central Asia. And I can tell that these issues are interlinked. Because improving the links, the interaction will enhance the position of Kazakhstan. It will create new opportunities, but at the same time new pressure. So it is important that here in Kazakhstan, there is a public policy in place for the companies and organizations to adapt and to benefit from these opportunities. And we see there is a link. So it's not two separate topics, but rather two interrelated topics. And I am honored to give the floor to Mr. Alihan Smailov, to the first Deputy Prime Minister of our country. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all the participants, and I would like to thank the foreign guests for their participation in the Astana Economic Forum, which became an important platform to discuss the important regional issues. And first of all, I would like to thank Mr. Andrei Sashali and his colleagues, not only for their participation, but also for the organization of this session. The cooperation with the OECD is an important priority for Kazakhstan and the government. It corresponds with our strategic goal 2015 to become one of the 30 most developed countries in the world. In the strategic development plan, we have set a goal to achieve a steady economic growth and the prosperity of people to the level of OECD countries. Today we see that the Eurasian Competitiveness Program, started 10 years ago, has become a quality platform for implementing the best practices and sharing experience between the countries of the Eurasian region and the OECD in improving competitiveness, attracting investment, and developing a smart business environment. We are the only country in Central Asia that signed a country cooperation program with OECD. And today we have a broad cooperation with this organization. And we have an active work with the key committees and working bodies of the OECD. And we raised the status of the investment committee. And also we have the participant status in 9 committees. Along with the OECD member countries, we have an opportunity to participate in the developing of a new OECD legal framework, as well as to discuss global issues in order to deepen cooperation with the organization, there is a coordination council of cooperation chaired by the Prime Minister of Kazakhstan and with the participation of all cabinet members. The government has approved the national roadmap to implement the OECD recommendations, which is the effective mechanism for implementing these recommendations for more than 10 years. The structural, economic, and political and social reforms for our country has been the OECD standards. Kazakhstan is part of the 50 competitive countries and is in the top 30 countries in ease of doing business. More than 320 billion US dollars of foreign direct investment has been attracted, which accounts for 80% of all investment in Central Asia. And this tells us about the confidence of the world business in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan observes the international rules of doing business, and Kazakhstan's trade with the OECD countries accounts for more than half of its total trade. One of the most important recommendations have already been implemented in the Plan of Nation initiated by the President. 100 steps on the implementation of 5 institutional reforms. A legislative framework has been adopted based on the best OECD practices and standards to protect the rights of private property, improve the efficiency of state bodies, fight the corruption, improve the living standards and principles of the rule of law. The number of recommendations are reflected in such programs of the development as the Strategic Development Plan of Kazakhstan until 2025, Concept of Family and Gender Policy of Kazakhstan until 2030. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the OECD standards are important for us to improve the quality of life. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Ismailov. We are very pleased to hear your report, and we are happy to see the new stage of our cooperation with Kazakhstan. And before we start the discussion of the first topic, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andreas Schall, Director of OECD Global Relations Secretariat.
Prime Minister Ismailov, Minister Dalenov, Vice Minister Kamaliev, ministers, ambassadors, friends and colleagues. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to open this OECD Kazakhstan session and to see so many distinguished guests from OECD members, from partner Eurasia countries and international partners in this joint session. It's a testimony of the very strong cooperation between the OECD and Kazakhstan, and it's also a testimony for the growing importance of the topic we are discussing today, namely productivity and regional connectivity. As the first Deputy Prime Minister said, the OECD-Kazakhstan cooperation has been broadening since 2008, when Kazakhstan became the first supporter of the OECD Eurasia Competitiveness Program. In 2015, Kazakhstan became the first ever country to implement an OECD country program. 2 years later, Kazakhstan also became the first country in the region to host the OECD Eurasia Week, which is the annual ministerial level gathering of OECD and Eurasia partner countries. And I want to thank you again wholeheartedly for your host at that time and today. Yesterday evening was a great testimony of Kazakhstan's hospitality, and we're very grateful to all of you and to the government of Kazakhstan. Let me say, today we are facing a period of global sluggish growth, volatile commodity prices, and in this context, OECD-Kazakhstan cooperation has helped to improve policies here in the country on a wide range of areas. Implementation challenges remain, of course, but there was clear evidence and a commitment of the to action based on OECD work in many spheres. For example, Kazakhstan has increasingly opened economic sectors to foreign investment, which is key for all OECD members, but also for countries beyond OECD membership. And Kazakhstan has also introduced facilitation mechanism like the business ombudsman, which helped a lot for the investment in the country. At the same time, participation in OECD bodies and in such OECD-led global initiatives as the fight against cross-border tax evasion, and you're the finance minister, gives Kazakhstan a more active role and gives a greater voice in international economic governance. It also allows the country to bring perspectives to high-level international discussion, such as investment, industry, and education. OECD members also increasingly recognize Kazakhstan as a regional hub and reform leader in Central Asia. It is a major supporter of OECD work in the region. It has financed work on trade, transport connectivity that we will discuss this morning. For that, we at the OECD and the neighbors in Central Asia are very grateful to the government of Kazakhstan. So a very warm spasiba bolchoy for that support. Hope we continue to do on that basis. You will see one of the fruits of this is our report. The colleagues from the ITF will present later on transport connectivity and the work we are doing for going for growth on productivity. It's also laid out over there. We have enough copies, so feel free to take them. We have enough to sell them and to give them away. So today we will focus on two projects that directly address the challenge of a more diversified, sustained growth in Kazakhstan in the regions. First, and this is the short note on productivity, which is part on going for growth, which shows that Kazakhstan GDP per capita is now at the level of many OECD countries, but labor productivity remains low, remains a challenge. Moreover, productivity growth has been negative in recent years. Most employment in the country are concentrated in low productivity sector. For example, resource extraction generates up to 20% of GDP, but employs a mere of 2% of working population. At the same time, close to half of the working population are in activities where average productivity is less than half of the national average. Creating more high productivity jobs and sectors will be essential to achieve a more inclusive growth path in the country, which is crucial and which is also a goal which we share with many OECD economies. A variety of factors impedes this productivity growth, and our director from our economics department, Alain Desser, will speak in more detail about it. But there are market distortions induced by the very large role of state-owned enterprises, heavy regulation network sectors. And that's why the OECD product market regulation indicators shows that regulation in Kazakhstan are less conducive to competition than the OECD average. So there is something we can continue to work together and achieve. We will then turn in the second part of this morning to connectivity. Physical distance to major centers of global demand is, of course, a major challenge, not only in Kazakhstan, but in Central Asia. And it explains only part of the connectivity gap confronting the region. Our ITF estimates of the connectivity gap in today's report suggest that only in Uzbekistan does physical distance account for half the connectivity gap vis-à-vis the benchmark economy, Germany. And it's only by incidence that this is my home country, which we have chosen as a benchmark. Elsewhere, inadequate infrastructure, high transport costs, longer border crossing times, all of which policies can address, account for more. And let me be very clear, it's not about becoming only a transit country, but its connectivity means better integration into global value chain. Connectivity means better integration into trade policies. And this is something we discussed yesterday with the first Deputy Prime Minister and also with Minister Dalenov. This is something we can also work together in the run-up of MC12, which Kazakhstan is hosting here, I think, in this place in a bit more than 1 year from now. Trade facilitation, cross-border measures are kind of low-hanging fruits to reduce the costs of connectivity and also to make sure that Kazakhstan is better integrated into regional trade, but also better integrated in the global economy. Before I close, I want to stress that we are talking today not just about numbers, about indicators, but we are talking about our people, our citizens. Productivity is not just about making workers more efficient machines. It's about enabling them to improve their skills, incomes, working conditions. And connectivity does more than facilitate the movement of goods and capital. It enables the diffusion of technology and, more crucially, of ideas. In the end, that means more and better jobs, particularly for countries that invest in skills and education. And this is one of the crucial elements we also discussed with the government going forward, to focus on skills and education of the people. Next week we will have our ministerial in Paris. So we will discuss the digital transformation, and digitalization has a huge potential to enhance both productivity and connectivity, but only if we design and implement the policies needed to help the people thrive in a world of rapid and sometimes unsettling change. Regulation, competition, education, employment, social policies must all be part of the mix. And this is really crucial for our work going forward. And we will work closely with Kazakhstan on all these topics. We remain committed to sustain and further deepen our cooperation with Kazakhstan as a leader in the region, working together in the design and implement better policies for better lives, which is our leitmotif at the OECD. And let me close by the song which is sung by all Liverpool fans in the soccer stadium, "You'll Never Walk Alone." Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Теперь мы переходим к первой.
Now we are proceeding to the first topic of our today's session, labor productivity. This year, Kazakhstan is joining the work of our economic department to the project which is called Growing for Growth, and our economy department is engaged in this for more than 10 years already. And this work is focused on the competition and regulation of markets. There are very detailed indicators of regulation of various sectors and a level of openness of the economy in general. And joining of Kazakhstan to this work gives us now an opportunity to compare Kazakhstan with all other countries which are participating in this very important work, all OECD so important partners. So this is not a new topic for Kazakhstan. The government was engaged in this work already for a long time, but now it is a reflection of some programs, reflection of some problems, especially labor productivity growth, which the dynamics of which is very slow, and the possible ways to move forward. Prior to give floor to my colleague who will present this work, now I would like to invite Minister of National Economy, Mr. Ruslan Dalenov. Thank you very much. Dear Mr. Smilov, dear guests, dear forum participants, today our dialogue is devoted to the work with OECD. And first of all, I would like to express gratitude to OECD team, and personally to Andreas Schall. I would like to express gratitude. This is a very important work. And 1 month ago, I had dialogue with my colleague from the country, from one of the regions, and we talked about the issue whether our countries are following OECD standards, about our plans, who will be the first, who will be ahead. So as in terms of following the standards of OECD, it was a very good dialogue on competitiveness, and this is a good example that OECD standards let us think about the best experience, good standards of OECD countries, and since we are striving to become one of the 30 best countries in the world, cooperation with OECD in area of development of economic policy would help us to implement systemic reforms in various sectors of economy. And recently, that interaction with OECD has been strengthened. 5 institutional reforms were approved in 2015. And this document now is focus and orient us towards the future activities. And today, these reforms are based on the principles and standards of OECD, and they have been obtained in the course of the research. 65 recommendations were obtained, and 38 38 recommendations have been already reflected in the plan of nation 100 steps. And so some of them were for the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth reforms. So also we signed the country program in 2015, and 13 projects were implemented, and health, employment, social integration, education, professional development, environment, competitiveness and business climate, regional development, public administration, statistics. These were areas where we received recommendations. The second phase, which cover 15 projects, are now at the moment, and by year 2020, we expecting final recommendations. Currently, 3 projects have been completed, and another 12 projects are in the process. For the next year, there are proposals to work together in areas such as skills, which is very important area, because, as it was mentioned, productivity is slowing down as compared to other. So labor productivity, tourism, with great potential. Recently, we discussed state program of tourism, public administration, in order to have good public administration, and anti-corruption policy. These are only 5 projects which are under discussion. And the dynamics of cooperation shows that we cover almost all vital areas of public administration. So in order to upgrade living well-being, a number of recommendations have been already reflected in some strategic documents. So Kazakhstan Strategic Development Plan 2025, the concept of family and gender policy, productive employment and mass entrepreneurship program, anti-corruption strategy, as well as in sectoral laws in the field of competition, investment, and green policy, public administration. 535 OECD recommendations were obtained. So this means that there were gaps in our instructions, our laws. This does not speak that there were great gaps in our laws and regulations. This speaks to the fact that a lot of work has been done, and 189 recommendations have been implemented since 2018. And 43 recommendations have been implemented this year. And in 2020, we are planning to implement 2 more recommendations. In this way, all recommendations will be implemented. Also, for us, it is very important that our legislation comply with the OECD standards and principles. We intend to join all 29 legal instruments We have already joined to 19 Declaration on Green Growth, OECD Declaration on International Investment and Multinational Enterprise, Declaration on Propriety, Integrity and Transparency in the Conduct of International Business and Finance, recommendation on the Council on Regulatory Policy and Governance, a recommendation of the Council of Gender Equality in Education, Employment and Entrepreneurship, and others. And accession to the remaining 10 legal instruments has been initiated. As for committees, from 49 OECD committees, we are participating in 35 working bodies, and we have also status of associate in 2 committees and in 9 committees and working bodies as a participant, in 17 as an invitee, and in 7 structures we are partners. Today, GDP per capita growth is about 28 point. Yeah, is so the GDP per capita and purchasing power parity is at the level of OECD countries, that is $600. So GDP has grown 20 times over the past 20 years. In 2018, it was it was also reached through non-raw material sectors. And major factors of economic growth are investment activity, inflation stabilization, and stabilization in basic economy sectors. These have also helped to raise, helped our people to raise their income. So as for unemployment rate is at the low level, 4.9%. In order to reach the level of developed countries, we set ambitious tasks to reach by year 2050 GDP per capita 60,000 US dollars, life expectancy 84 years. Now life expectancy is 73. We know that in OECD countries it's 80 years. Unemployment rate shall be reduced 3-4%. We are already at the level of 4.9%, which is almost identical to the indicator of developed countries, 5.2%, and to increase exports of goods and services up to 90 billion US dollars, 56%. Also, we plan to reduce the share of government state participation in the economy. In OECD countries, the share is 15% of GDP. As per the same methodology, the share of state participation in the economy in Kazakhstan was reduced to 17.3% in 2018. At this point, we have the potential, and reaching it, we will get a new impetus in, to economic growth. We also would like to work on industrial innovation, development, also the digitalization, Nur-sultan program, agri-industrial complex development, and industrial development. Industrial innovation policy will be focused on highly productive processing industry. So also the labor productivity growth will be the very important focus. We have already started implementing Digital Kazakhstan program. So electronic format will be offered for many services and in online regime. This is very important direction. We think that digitalization is new world trend, and Kazakhstan will still have more opportunities for trading and for transit through our country of parcels and orders, e-orders through our transit corridors. By international forecasts, the volume of e-parcels will grow more than 6 times for upcoming 5 years. This expands transit opportunities, and this will be used by us to raise to create jobs. Also, development of vocational training and higher education. There was very good speech of Mr. German at the plenary meeting that skills shall be developed and there shall be synergy because many companies already raise standards, and we need to interfere in the education programs in order to let the companies employ very highly skilled people. Also, regulation for favorable climate for business and privatization in order to cut non-productive costs of business. We have revised permission systems in order to see permits systems in order to see what administrative barriers could be lifted. Probably the majority of complaints were on behalf of business were towards the administrative barriers, and today we are preparing a new package to reduce the burden on business, and we are actively interacting with business community, with OECD, in order to see what else we can reduce in terms of burden. So in order to eliminate barriers for all kinds of references, papers, and this is important for expansion of competitiveness. By the way, by simpleness of business conduct, we are among 30 best countries. Ease of doing business is good, is at the good level, and SMEs are expanding and growing. And today, as for competitiveness, we have about 25,000 entities with participation of the government, and we could agree with conclusions of OECD, but also we need to understand that majority of them, 90%, are organizations of social sphere where competitiveness is not violated. As for other companies, there is comprehensive privatization program by year 2020. The main principle of which is individual approach to each company, depending on their specificity. And within our program, about 900 organizations will be sold and given to private sector. So, and nowadays we have that the plan has been fulfilled by 85%. So the pace is good. Yellow Pages principles are followed, and so in this way, the almost half of types of activities where the government could participate has been reduced, and we are confident that privatization will create good conditions for private business, and we also see that that it's quite easy to create a company, private company in Kazakhstan in terms of registration, but it's hard, yes, it's true, it's hard to work. And also there is a problem of bankruptcy. And also there are quite a sufficient number of small and large companies. We have a few medium size companies, and we are, thanks to OECD, we are now thinking about this problem in order to see what we can do in order to promote development of medium size businesses. So, so 18 indicators were used to make diagnostics of weaknesses and strengths of the reforms in the country, and now OECD priorities have been correlated here in Kazakhstan, and economic growth is all for upgrading living conditions of people, well-being of the people. Digitalization is another area. Recently, I heard a dialogue, Jack Ma, that today electronic technologies, internet, penetrated so deeply to villages also that elderly person of 82 years, he asked in China through internet to order a real authentic American hamburger. And within 24 hours, 3 companies have provided a real authentic hamburger from US. So you can just imagine to deliver authentic US hamburger to the village in China. So this speaks to the fact that internet is opening new horizons. So 10 years ago, it was quite hard to imagine that some products will be delivered from one country to another country so quickly. All types of sorts of registrations, permits would be required. But now there are great opportunities, by the way, for employment in rural areas, labor productivity rise in rural areas. So we will be looking at this area in our research. Once again, dear session participants, let me express gratitude to OECD and OECD team, which for their invaluable contribution. We are so happy with their work, and we just look forward to bright perspectives of our cooperation.
I wanted to add a couple of words to the information of the previous speaker. The issues of labor productivity is relevant for our country, and the first president in his previous addresses talked about the third modernization of the country and the opportunities of economic development in the context of the industrial revolutions happening globally. So these tasks have been implemented as part of our roadmap and state programs, but the new government has a task to enhance the efficiency of this work. So we organized a special working group that will review and analyze all of our state programs, the industrial development, the agro-industrial, the healthcare, the education and employment sectors, and all these programs should take into account the support measures that should provide the maximum effect. So we have a task now to optimize, to streamline the cost, and to enhance the efficiency. And we are doing this work now, and we want to link this to the preparation of the third-year budget, so that all these results and outcomes are taken into account by the summer for the budget or for the period of 2020 and 2022. So we would be very grateful to our international colleagues providing their recommendations. They will be taken into account. Thank you. Thank you very much to the minister, not only for his speech, but I shall thank the minister in general for the support they provide for this activity. And I must stress that the work that we will present today, it's not just the work that has been done by the OECD, it's a joint work. We depend heavily on the support and work of our colleagues. And what my colleague Alain Dessert is going to present now, we would not be able to do it without the help of the Ministry of National Economy. And I also want to thank Mr. Minister for his focus on the agriculture, because even in OECD countries, the potential of digitalization in traditional sectors is underestimated. We talk a lot about hubs, the IT hubs, and things like that. This is all good, but there is a huge potential when we talk about agriculture and other traditional sectors.
To my colleague Alain Dessert, the Deputy Director of the OECD's Economics Department. Alain, please.
Now it's better. Okay, sorry. Okay, good morning all, ministers, Vice Minister. It's a real pleasure for me to be here at the forum to highlight some of the key findings of the work we've been doing on how product market reform can help sustain growth in the next few decades so that Kazakhstan can fulfill its objective of joining the club of most advanced economies. We know, as has been mentioned, that the key to this achievement will be closing the productivity gap vis-a-vis the most advanced economy. Now, if we take the upper half of OECD countries, about the 17 most advanced economies, OECD countries, because not all advanced economies are part of the OECD, but if we focus on the 17 most advanced OECD countries, and we take this as a good approximation of the top 30 club, and we look at the performance of Kazakhstan over the past 2 decades. Now, the first thing to note is the remarkable progress that the country has achieved since 2000 in closing the productivity gap, in other words, in catching up. It started with a productivity gap of about 75% in 2000 and moved all the way up to around 50%. So in some ways, this is a good achievement. And only, among other major economies, only China has achieved that much. So it's quite remarkable progress. Now, we know at the same time that a good chunk of this progress was really coming from the extractive industries, especially oil and gas. And now this high dependence on oil and commodities is also reflected in the fact that productivity performance has been much weaker over the past 10 years, something that was highlighted in earlier speeches. We can see that from an average annual growth rate of over 6%, this has declined to about 2% over the past decade, over the past 10 years. Now, this is still better than the average performance in most advanced economies, so that has allowed for a bit of further catching up. But it's unlikely to be sufficient looking forward to continue and pursue in closing the gap. So the one question behind this is what factors could help restore strong productivity growth so that really Kazakhstan can achieve its objective and reach the club of most advanced economy. As it was alluded to a bit earlier, among those factors, certainly one that is very important will be a successful digital transformation of the economy. And as Andreas has mentioned, this will be the topic of our coming ministerial meeting next week. We have done quite a bit of work in the past 2 years at the OECD. We had a major program of work on digitalization, the impact of digitalization on the economy. And one thing that came up from this is that harnessing the productivity potential of digital technology is challenging everywhere, not just every country is struggling with this. What this chart is showing is that if we look at the productivity performance of individual firms across a large pool of advanced economies, what we find is that we see a growing gap in the productivity level between a small group of highly performing firms and the rest. And this growing gap is particularly important, if you look at the left panel, is particularly visible in industry with a high degree of digital intensity. So where we see there is about 5% of the firms, of top firms, have enjoyed strong productivity growth of about 2-3% a year over the past decade, but the rest, the remaining firms, have hardly seen any productivity gains at all. Now, combining this information that we have, this data, with data on adoption of digital technologies, we were able to shed some lights on some of the key drivers of successful digital technology adoptions. In other words, what we've been trying to do is to understand what it is, what are the factors that make some firms so much better than others at not only adopting technologies, but making the most of them. And in a nutshell, we can, based on this work, categorize these factors into 3 broad groups, 3 broad categories: incentives, capabilities, and opportunities. Incentive is all about the pressures that firms are facing to invest in new technologies so as to keep their competitive edge, so have to continue to innovate and to remain leaders in their own industries. So it's all about the degree of market competition, market openness, level playing field, ease of entry and exit, all these factors that are conducive to very dynamic business sectors. Lots of churn, lots of turnover, new firms that comes in with new ideas and are growing fast. They're the ones who contribute to fast growth. The second factor, capabilities, is all about skills. Now here it's not only general skills in terms of literacy, problem solving, although this is very important, but also about technical skills, exposure to computer, understanding digitalization, and perhaps above all, good managerial skills. It takes good managers to transform, to rethink the business process within a firm in order to make it most effective in exploiting the new technologies, in thinking about how this can affect supply chains, how this can affect relationships with customers, and so on. So this is another very important aspect. The third one, opportunities, is all about allowing new firms, especially innovative firms, to achieve the scale that is needed to make their investment profitable, the vast investment. So it is about connectivity, something that we'll be talking a bit more about in the next presentation. So if I want to be a bit more concrete to give an illustration of what we've done, we have estimated the productivity gains associated with the adoption of very specific technologies and how these gains vary according to the policy settings in place in several areas, including the 3 areas that I just mentioned, competition, skills, and connectivity. In this case, in the case of the the specific technologies we focus on are cloud computing, enterprise resource planning, and customer relationship management. You can think of the latter two as technologies that help integrating back office and front office operation in the firms. So what the chart shows, actually, is that the productivity gains the productivity gains arising from the adoption of these technologies have been significantly higher among firms that operate in countries where the talent pool is better developed. This is the skills factor if you look at the first bar on the left. Also in countries where the access to high-speed internet is more widespread. This is the connectivity factors. You look at the second bar on the left. Also among firms operating in countries where the degree of product market competition is higher, more intense. And this is, again, the competition factor, the third bar from the left. In all these cases, you can see that having this set of policies have allowed to have stronger gains associated with the acquisition of digital technologies. So based on that, with that, one question is to see what type of policy changes would best help a country like Kazakhstan to create the conditions for successful adoption of technologies and maintaining strong productivity growth. So one objective of the project conducted with the Ministry of National Economy has been to apply the methodology of our so-called Going for Growth framework to help identify the more specific policy reforms that would best contribute to boosting income through productivity, but also job creation, but also to making sure that these productivity gains, employment gains, are broadly shared across the population, and they are also consistent with sustainable environmental sustainability in the longer run. So this is how the Going for Growth framework, the purpose and how it functions. The principle behind the framework is to benchmark both the economic performance and policies of a country against the OECD average across the broad range of policy areas, and to see in which one is a country lagging behind the most, so that this is where policymakers should focus in order to get the biggest bang for the buck and to improve conditions the country by in the most effective way. So one thing that this implies, being able to do that, this implies that we're able to measure policy settings in a number of areas. And this is not always trivial, of course, to do that. And I just want to illustrate in the context of our project, one area where we've applied one methodology to measure policy, the extent of policy, in a way that we can compare across countries the performance of the settings in Kazakhstan and to see to what extent some improvement would be needed and in which areas and what type of policy recommendations this would lead to. So the area I want to focus on is competition, one of the three main areas, the one that has an impact on the incentives for firms to adopt digital technologies in order to remain competitive. Now, competitive product markets require a number of things. A sound legal and judicial infrastructure, that's very important, protection of property rights, rule of law, and so on. It also requires an effective competition regimes, one that detects effectively and sanctions anti-competitive behavior. It requires also allowing firms that are not performing to exit the market so that it frees resource for new firms to come in. But one important aspect also is to make sure that product market regulation is designed in a way that avoids creating unnecessarily barriers to entry. Now, in his slide, the minister referred to this as partly deregulation. It is partly deregulation, but it's not only deregulation. It's not so much deregulation, but it's smarter regulation. Regulation is there to achieve legitimate objective linked to the environment, to health and protection, to market integrity. But in implementing this type of regulation, what matters is to do it in a way, again, that avoid creating unnecessarily barriers to competition. And over the past 20 years, we have developed at the OECD an indicator, a survey and an indicator that allows us to measure the extent to which regulation, product market regulation in individual countries is conducive or inhibit competition among incumbents and in the product market more generally by creating barriers to entry. This is based on a fairly extensive collection of legislative information across many areas, and to measure the incidence of regulatory barriers to competition through either distortion induced by the state intervention, as well as via various legal and administrative barriers to the entry of domestic and foreign firms. And if we focus on, say, the one aspect, which is competition among incumbents, what we see we will be looking at is things like the scope of state-owned enterprise, SOEs, their governance, things like price controls, command and controls regulation, the regime that governs public procurement, and to what extent public procurement is used in a way that stimulates competition or, in contrast, slows competition, as well as the interaction with stakeholders, so how is lobbying governed in the countries to avoid having the possibility for firms to create their own barriers to competition to enjoy the rents that they may be benefiting from. There's also whole aspects that focus on barriers to entry, facilitating the entry of firms, both from the domestic side and the foreign entry side. So on the domestic side, we're looking at licensing procedure, what has been mentioned earlier, administrative burdens on startup, but also a number of barriers in specific sectors, network and services sectors. And on the foreign side, we'll look at barriers to trade facilitation and the differential treatment of foreigners. Now, one major contribution of the project has been to apply this survey, develop this type of indicators, this index, for Kazakhstan, and in a way that makes it that can be compared to other countries. So it's important here that the way we turn the legislative information, the qualitative information, the quantitative index is done in a way that we can compare countries and see how countries fare in terms of having regulation that is favorable or friendly to competition or not. So the indicator is constructed in the form of an index of a scale of 0 to 6, and the higher is the index, then the less friendly, the higher are the barriers, the regulatory barriers to competition. So if we look at the top panel, what we find is that overall, this is the top panel is the overall, the aggregate index combining all information from all sides. And what we see is that overall regulatory barriers to competition are relatively high in Kazakhstan, although it is lower than what we find in a number of major non-OECD countries, such as South Africa, Brazil, and Argentina, where barriers to competition are higher. But generally, Kazakhstan comes up with somewhat higher barriers to competition than in most OECD countries, and especially some of the leading countries in that area. However, if we focus on one aspect, and an aspect that has been mentioned, the minister has mentioned the efforts that have been made, that are being made to lower the administrative burden on startups. We see it from this chart, the bottom panel. We see here that Kazakhstan is doing better than the OECD average in this case. So already previous reforms in that area have helped enormously positioning Kazakhstan into a favorable position in terms of the strict ease of opening up a business in Kazakhstan. So that's certainly one good aspect. However, it's clear that competition is not only about administrative burden and the ease of entry. If you have markets that are dominated by powerful incumbents, this can also be a deterrent to the entry of competitors, and especially if the incumbents benefit from favorable treatment and conditions, as this will distort the level playing field and discourage potential entrants who may feel they have no chance to compete against the incumbents if they have too big domination of the market. And this is often an issue with state-owned enterprise. But in this case, it's not only the presence of state-owned enterprise and their pervasiveness that is important, but how they are governed. Now, again, if we look at the top panel here in this chart, what we see is something that, of course, is well known by most people, if not all people in this room, is state-owned enterprise are fairly widespread in the Kazakh economy. There's been efforts to privatize. It has gone through, but still. Nevertheless, if you look, Kazakhstan is not in bad company in that regard. In fact, the presence of state-owned enterprise is more widespread in countries like Poland and France, which are not exactly badly performing countries. But the difference is, if you look at the bottom panel, is that the difference between Kazakhstan and Poland and France is that in Kazakhstan, the governance of state-owned enterprise is much less conducive to a level playing field. In other countries, in other words, state-owned enterprise are more forced to operate on a commercial basis, operate as if they were like a private company. They are more exposed to market pressure. They are more insulated from political interference, and this can make a difference. So it's not so much or only the presence of state-owned enterprise, but again, how they are governed that will have an important impact on competition in a country. It's a combination of these two things. So there is definitely scope to improve on both aspects in the case of Kazakhstan, as many countries have done in the past. Now, another area where Kazakhstan can improve its policy settings, again, with a view to facilitate greater competition, facilitate entry. We've seen that the entry of domestic firm is relatively easy on paper, in terms of low administrative burden on startup, but it may be a bit more difficult in the case of foreign supplier. Two of the components that are survey measures relate directly to the regulatory barriers to the entry of foreign suppliers. One is to what extent foreigners are treated differently in terms of a number of features, such as, for example, access to public procurement, or in terms of recognition of the credentials of specialists in regulated professions. And here what we see from the top panel is that, again, Kazakhstan comes up relatively highly in that regard, and so leaving quite a bit of scope for, this is one area where there could be reform that could facilitate the entry. We know a lot of progress has been made. There are more entry, there are more foreigners, there are more, the domestic market is opening up to, but this is still, there's still scope to do more in this area. And perhaps even more, if you look now at the bottom panel, the other aspects is trade facilitation, which often is as important as direct trade barriers like tariffs or non-tariffs barriers. Trade facilitation is all about behind the border procedures, controls, and this can be hampering trade both directions. In this case, I'm emphasizing a bit more the entry of foreign goods as a way to increase competition, to facilitate the transfer of technology and know-how, but this can also work in terms of making it complicated for domestic firms to access foreign countries. And again, thinking about the connectivity issue that will be discussed. So these are two areas where, again, Kazakhstan, when we compare to other countries, there's definitely scope and there's definitely specific measures that can be taken to improve the situation, and would be happy to work with the country in order to help in that regard. Now, before I close, just a brief word on the second set of factors that I referred to, opportunities, which is about achieving the scale, allowing firms to achieve the scale they need to really make good return on their investment, initial investment in digital technologies and all sorts of intangible assets, to encourage them to innovate, to invest in innovation. And again, I don't want to talk too much about transport infrastructure because that will be the topic mentioned by some of the next speakers. But one aspect of course, of connectivity is digital infrastructure, the quality of digital infrastructure. And here, there's various ways of measures digital the connectivity in that regard, to what extent. One of which we can look at, this is the bottom panel here, is the extent to which broadband connections are widespread across the population. This looks at the access, the fixed broadband subscription in the population. It's important also, it would be important to have information about the spreading of broadband subscription among firms, because to what extent firms have access to high-speed internet is a critical factors for the adoption of digital technologies. But in any case, what we can see here is that, again, Kazakhstan lags behind advanced economies in terms of the rolling out of broadband penetration. Now, this is something that can move very fast. So this is 2017 numbers, maybe already this is catching up, but this is something just to pay attention and make sure we have good information on that to see how much the country is progressing on that. Now, one aspect, giving the infrastructure is one part of it, but offering a service, allowing firms and population to use high-speed internet with good quality and at reasonable cost is also a matter of having good competition among the providers of communications, the providers of internet access, the providers of mobile phone access. And there again, having competition among these service providers is a matter also of regulations. Our survey of regulation, the information we collect is throughout, covers the whole economy, but there's a lot of information collected on specific industries, and in particular network industries, such as transport, communications, and energy. And so we can also look the extent to which the degree of barriers to competition arising from regulation is more or less high in the countries compared to other countries. And what our results show again is that in each case, in the case of transport, it's not as big an issue. Regulation is a bit more strict or less friendly to competition than in Kazakhstan and OECD countries. But where there's a bigger gap is in the important area of e-communications. OECD countries over the past 10, 15 years have done enormous progress in changing regulation in telecommunications or e-communications, and this has had enormous impact in the quality of the service, communication services, innovation, and the cost. And what we can see here when you compare the middle bar, the difference in the degree of regulatory barriers to competition in Kazakhstan versus OECD average, this is one area as well where there could be quite some progress. So let me stop here, but there is more into the report that we have been preparing and for which we present the preliminary results now. And we're certainly, what is very important is that we continue working together, Minister, in ensuring that we make the most of this information. We can best help you to understand what it is, the more specific areas of regulation where actions can be taken to improve these performance. And also giving you information about how other countries that have gone through this, what they've done, what they focus on, to what extent they've been able to change regulation in a way that then help the economy to improve performance. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. I note that a number of the issues you raised, SOE governance, competition, productivity, skills, digitization. I'm pleased to say these are areas where we are already working actively with Kazakhstan through various OECD directorates and under various OECD bodies. And of course, we're committed to continue to work on those issues with Kazakhstan. We now have a few minutes to, можно вот открыть дискуссию залу.
Now we have a few minutes. Probably now we can have opportunity to pose questions and short comments. We have 15 minutes prior to shift to the next section, next part of our session. So questions, comments, please, from the audience. First of all, I would like to express gratitude the first Deputy Prime Minister. He will leave because they are waiting him. So I am ambassador of Belgium in Nur-sultan.
And their very learnful explanations. I also took heed of advices of OECD, and I see that Belgium also has a lot of improvement to do with regard to government intervention and public policy. I have a question to the ministers who still stay here, because Belgium is an SME country, and when companies come here, it needs level playing field. The first president, El-Bassi, has called for more investment and more export. But one of the OECD teachings I have seen is that you cannot have investment and exports without imports. And this is an important issue which I would like to really emphasize. This is regarding trade and investment because they are both linked. And then, and especially, I think about the agro-industrial sector, which has been mentioned by the OECD as a very promising field. Sometimes we have difficulties in getting high-value added agricultural elements, like you may love, but beneficial insects is an important issue for developing agro-industry in Kazakhstan. My second question is about the investment themselves and the level playing field. Rule of law has been mentioned by OECD, but just as one element among others, but I think it's really very important. AIFC, arbitral tribunal, English judges, it's very nice, but again, for an SME country, you need a level playing field on the ground, in the field, and it's not in Nur-sultan Astana that it will be done. So this is my second question, is about, I mean, there is a lot of improvement in Kazakhstan about e-justice and developing digitalized justice, very important, but also independence of justice, having really an independent justice which is not tributary to the executive. Very important for investors. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps the minister would like to respond briefly. Minister.
The minister will answer this question.
Я думаю, что инвестиции
I think that investments and trade, yes, this could be compared with bicycles, a bicycle and bicycle rider. So the government thinks that it shall stimulate investments to this sector, to this or that sector, in order to raise productivity, but it shall also look after bicycle riders to look after themselves as well. So the government shall do a lot in terms of developing policy in order to open to maximum extent the market, in order to facilitate conditions for creation of the company, for liquidation of the company, in order not to avoid dominance of the government on this market, and to reduce the barriers in order not to impede competitiveness. That's why I think that this shall be two-party approach. So also in terms of developing skills, teaching skills, and creation of conditions for competitiveness. Thank you. Any other people who would like to say something?
The question from the Belgian ambassador, I think what you raised about the SME sector and about a vibrant SME sector is very important in the case of Kazakhstan also, and that's why we are discussing, when we are discussing productivity, also the question, how can we improve the regulation, the rules for a business-friendly environment, for access to finance and for kind of stimulating entrepreneurship, having skills for entrepreneurship. And this is also an experience we have made, and Bill Thompson has been working on this in the transition in Central and Eastern European countries. The foreign direct investment and the big investor coming from outside was part of the story. The automotive sector in Central Eastern Europe, big German or French companies investing in a country. But the other part of the story, and this is what makes the success also sustainable, is developing a vibrant SME sector. And this is something we want to further go down the road here in Kazakhstan also.
When there was presentation, I downloaded one interesting research on impact of artificial intelligence to productivity, on productivity. And it says that by year 2035, 1/3 of productivity will be ensured through artificial intelligence. China would add by year 2030 to GDP $3 trillion only through artificial, 3.7 North America, North Europe 1.8 trillion, Southern Europe almost 1 trillion, half trillion Latin America, and the rest of the world is 2.1. Digitalization, artificial intelligence provide wide opportunities. By year 2030, GDP will grow to 15 trillion US dollars for the whole world. Artificial intelligence would promote creation of jobs, and 75% of interaction between buyers would be also regulated by artificial intelligence, and this would happen already in year 2020. So cameras would be switched to artificial intelligence, and 4 billion devices would be voice skins. Digital technologies would ensure personalization of labor force, personalization of trade, and I think that the barriers will be lifted in future for developments of SMEs. In plain words, corruption could be won only by digits, and that's why nothing could be stop. Nothing can stop business to step in if this is done in a digital way. Thank you. Since I don't see any other hands raised, I would like to add what Andreas said. Yes, I always repeat that SME sector, as for general environment, general business climate for doing business, is like a story that when we ask SMEs, this is what any normal firm or company wants, large or small, which doesn't build business plan neither on any orientation, specific orientation or combating corruption. Stable tax administration system, access to finance, access to courts if necessary, economically normal, economically adequate conditions for dispute resolution. These are conditions which are needed for any healthy business. Large firms, large companies have their own resources, and they can act even when there are no adequate conditions. But SMEs are more vulnerable. They can't cope. So they shall combat with corruption. They don't have their own lawyers, their own departments and people interacting with the government. That's why when we speak about SME development, we are speaking about creation of general healthy business climate. If SMEs are not developing, this means that something is wrong in business environment of the country. And so SMEs would experience problems with air, as in the case with larger companies. One more question. If no questions, then let's proceed to the next very big topic, which is I'm interested in this topic for a long time, trade and transport connectivity, one of the major challenges for Central Asia, but which is at the same time is a great opportunity. Because now we see that development is now faster at the background of the Chinese, the route from China. There are more open economic policy now in Uzbekistan. Very many various moments which create unique opportunities for Central Asia. This is excellent. And as colleagues would say in more details, we shall not think that advantages and access to world markets would bring enormous benefits and advantages. On the contrary, Central Asian countries will have to do much in order to derive maximum economic benefit, well-being from these new opportunities. That's why I'm very much glad that the first stage of our work for Central Asia is close to the end. And now we are talking to the government of Kazakhstan about the new stage next year, that we speak about continuation of the project, because there are very important issues. We are raising them in our report, but they need to be continued, to be tackled. So once again, I would like to express gratitude to the government of Kazakhstan for financial support, because this project is financed by the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Not only OECD, but your neighbors in the region value very much this support, and they were so glad to participate in this project. And without the government support, of course, it would not be possible. Now I invite Deputy Minister of Industry and Infrastructural Development, Berik Kamaliyev. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Andreas Schall. Dear ladies and gentlemen, session participants, on behalf of our ministry, I would like to welcome you all at this session. Our ministry is working on three directions. Working steel in industry and transport, International Transport Forum. We are members of International Transport Forum, which is prestigious in the world in transport area, and previous topics on increasing labor productivity. I would like to say that without transport logistics, without transport costs, we will never raise labor productivity. This is a serious issue. That's why we are actively working with OECD. So optimization of local chains of value added is being implemented within the country program. This research, as it was mentioned, cover regional topics with Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Mongolia. Today, in Central Asian region, demonstrate great potential for cooperation. Central Asia, as you know, is one of the large transport nodes between Europe and Asia, 70 million population. Economic growth 5-year is ensured through 5% per annum, and goods turnover is growing. New air, railroad, road routes are developing, and large infrastructural projects were implemented in the course of the first stage of Nur-sultan program, and now they are developing the program for years covering the period from 2020 to 2025. It's a very important government program for us on all issues regarding infrastructure. Kazakhstan has modernized already Aktau seaport, and also Khargos eastern gates. We have renovated and reconstructed railroads, roads. Which recommendations have been adopted by us and implemented in the course of joint work with OECD? If to speak about the payments, 5 kilometers roads are now charging payments. Also, the tariffs are low. Still, we want to continue on stage-by-stage basis. We'll be moving forward in order to promote export. There is a joint stock company which especially works on export promotion and transport logistics. And of course, we are very serious about promotion of exports through subsidized transport services. This tool is already working, and this has been also a result of our joint work with OECD. The PPP projects. We started the first project on roads Bakat. We already started. Turkish-Korean consortium is working. Very soon we'll be closing the loan agreement. As for railroads, Almaty-Shu project is being implemented, which would promote transit from China to Europe, to Central Asian countries, and other projects. Now we are working on the project of side road from Almaty, which will also promote railroad connections. As for our relations with other Central Asian countries, we are developing the project on construction of roads in Turkestan Oblast, which would increase our transit potential from Uzbekistan. And we know that our neighbors, Uzbekistan, are at good pace of development, of economic development. And as for Bakat, in all OECD projects, there are always recommendations on environmental issues. That's why this is again environmental state of our largest city, Almaty, and its suburbs. For Almaty and its suburbs, there are environmental problems, and also on annual basis, 200 from Almaty Oblast. Transit potential and issues related to emergency cases. These are elements of our large PPP project on construction of big Almaty Circle Road. So I mentioned Nur-sultan program, and it will be aimed at transport and infrastructure of our regions. So local networks, road services, development of regional airports. Our first president, he was focused on development of roads. And if at the first, initially, we were focused on the interregional roads, now the focus will be made on intra-regional roads. We call these roads to home. So roads between remote populated areas and are very important. Of course, we'll follow recommendations of OECD, and we talked to Andreas, and we talked that probably we need to invite transport experts to the next to the site of Astana Economic Forum. So International Transport Forum. We would like that transport issues and infrastructure issues could be covered in future within Astana Economic Forum. In terms of implementation of the fourth industrial revolution, digitalization, these issues become very crucial, and they are widely used in digitalization period, and of course will value our cooperation with OECD. And today, OECD will provide us with the results of their research recommendations, and our work will continue. Today, there are representatives of Kazakhstan transport community, our partners from international organizations. I would like to express hope that implementation of joint project with OECD will give us opportunities to develop transport infrastructure opportunities. I wish every good success in this work.
Господин Kamaliev.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamaliev.
To my colleague from the International Transport Forum, Mr. Yari Kaupila, who directed the analytical components of the project, and it was Yari and his team who produced the report which you have in front of you today. Yari, please.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, Vice Minister Kamaliev, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to launch officially the new report on enhancing connectivity and freight in Central Asia region. As already mentioned by my colleague Bill and the chair, this report is funded by the government of Kazakhstan, for which we are extremely grateful. Without that, this would not have been possible to do. As also mentioned by the Vice Minister, we are very pleased to have Kazakhstan have joined the ITF International Transport Forum back in 2017, together with nearly 60 other member governments, really working on the global transport issues, improving our connectivity, but also safety, security, and sustainability of that system. And Vice Minister, we very much welcome the invitation to join the Astana Economic Forum and bring the transport issues here in the future, and we are available to support you in that effort for sure at the International Transport Forum. I should say that this report should be available in the room, both in English and Russian language, and I will provide you a link at the end of my presentation for a free downloadable version of the report as well. So please have a look at that. Just to start with, I would just like to start by emphasizing the importance of freight connectivity and connectivity more in general. Connectivity provides access to regions, to markets. It reduces costs for domestic economy, which through improving quality of infrastructure and services. It provides access to international markets for trade. It does bring revenues from expanded transit, as mentioned by Vice Minister, but more importantly, better connectivity, freight connectivity, really lays foundations for future economic growth through wider economic benefits through the agglomeration effects that the transport has. Now, the report that you have in front of you has three parts. It focuses on 5 countries: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. I have to mention here that the project would not have been possible without the cooperation and support from all of the ministries, agencies in these countries, and which we're extremely grateful. The report has 3 parts. We look at benchmarking the performance of the Central Asia in terms of infrastructure, logistics, and customs. The second part really looks at an assessment of the regional connectivity gap and what are the future investment plans and how those might affect this connectivity gap. And the third part looks at assessing the current transport planning and governance in the countries of the region. As mentioned by the chair, this is of course a part of a larger OECD Enhancing Connectivity in Central Asia project. The work, and I will not go too much of a detail. I'm an economist by training, so I love models. I could talk about models forever, but I will not talk about them today too much. But the work on the assessment side is based on our in-house global freight model that covers every single road, railroad, airport, seaport in the world, and is a very, very detailed model that allows you to assess several different impacts of transport policies. Now, you all know better than I do that Central Asia is an extremely challenging region for transport connectivity, partly because of geographical characteristics, mountain areas, deserts, but also due to the very low population density and the location of cities across the vast region. But this tendency is reinforced by the economic diversification, by the economic growth, and especially by increasing economic concentration around the large cities. Here you see our calculations for GDP growth for main growth poles, the secondary growth poles, and lacking regions. And this diversification and concentration sets new challenges for transport and transport needs. The road freight is growing at the rate of 11% per year in the region. Compared to the rail, it's growing only 4% per year. Historically, the region has a high level of rail freight compared to many OECD countries, but this share is declining. So first challenge comes in terms of the road freight increase in the region. The second one, related to diversification of economies, is related to demand for more sophisticated, more diversified logistics services. And this is growing, and this is a second challenge. And these services are required especially around capital cities, capital areas, and around the new industries that are growing. Now, this is sort of a highlight map of the connectivity gap in the Central Asia region that we've measured. The connectivity gap between Central Asia and the developed economies is still extremely high. Access to global GDP, which is our measure for the connectivity, is around 50% of that of Germany. And sorry, again, comparing to Germany, as a Finn, I should compare to Finland, but I'll keep it to the Germany. This is partly due to the distance, as mentioned before, but it's not explaining everything. It is obviously partly because Central Asian countries are landlocked, so your access to cheap, low-cost maritime transport is limited. But it's also related to other high transport costs that stem from several different reasons. And when you actually decompose, before going to decomposing, this graph actually shows quite nicely the difference between the distance and the cost of Kazakhstan compared to the United States and Germany. For a Kazakhstan manufacturer, if you want to reach 20% of global GDP, you need to travel twice the distance compared to the United States or Germany. But if you look at the transportation costs for the same manufacturer, the transportation cost to reach the 20% of the global GDP is 5 times larger than of that of the United States or Germany. So it really shows the importance of reducing that transportation cost. Distance is important, but it needs to be compensated with appropriate policy measures. And when you decompose the connectivity gap, you can see that the countries differ and that there's no solution, one solution for all. So in order to reduce the connectivity gaps, countries need to focus not only on transport costs, the distance cannot be changed, but broad set of policies. These include logistics efficiency, border crossing times, efficiency of the transport and logistics sector overall, intermodality, and not to forget, we talked about labor productivity, we talk about productivity in general, the skill sets in the transport and logistics sector that are crucial for the countries to make the efficiency jump that is required. Now, as we all know, there are several investment plans, both at the regional level and also at the national level, that have been put in place or under discussions to improve connectivity. These major ones include the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to connect China with Europe through to Central Asia, both through rail and road connections, and perhaps a bit more focused on domestic economic development, the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program with the Asian Development Bank. These are just a couple of maps of many of the plans that are put forward for the region. Now, as part of this study, we used a model that I showed before to look at how these investment plans might affect the connectivity of the region. So what we did, we carried out an extensive data collection for the region, for all the countries, with several fact-finding missions, open source data, and I'll come back to the challenge of data in the region, which is not anything specific for this region. It is something very similar in many emerging economies around the world, the lack of good data. But I think we managed to collect very, very good data about the current infrastructure, the quality of the infrastructure, and the characteristics of that, but also the investment plans that are either already existing, under construction, planned, or being discussed. And for rail, and also for road network. And you can see in the map the level of detail in the work that we did on the links of looking at how these investment plans will affect the connectivity. And here you see the blue lines are the key CAREC corridors in Central Asia and Mongolia. And then you have several layers of motorways, national roads, regional roads, local or even unpaved roads, either existing or under construction or planned, for which each we have data on their impact on the future capacities as well. So what we did, we modeled the impact of this on connectivity using our freight model. And what did we find? We found, not surprisingly, that the existing investment plans will reduce the connectivity gap in all the countries up to 5 to 10% depending on the region, depending, of course, on the actual links, what you're talking about. So what you see here are averages, but the link level connectivity might be very different from the national averages. But what we also notice is that these investment plans that are put in place or planned are not enough to maintain the existing performance of the network, given the growth in transport volumes that we project for the future. We're seeing a shift in global economic gravity, shifting towards Asia, and we project quite significant increases in freight volumes, both internally in the Asia region, but also as a transit region. And so you see there are several bottlenecks that will start emerging unless they haven't already emerged in the region. Some of them are still in the key corridors, but as you see, most of the key corridors will, given the investment plans in the pipeline, manage the growth in volume. But what is important here is the fact that several roads, especially outside the core corridors, are the ones where you see the key bottlenecks emerging. And this is very important because these connections are crucial for the local small and medium-sized economies to be able to connect to the global markets. If you can't do that, you will not reap the benefits of improved connectivity at the national economy level. So reinforcing the point of connecting your local industries to these key corridors in order to really benefit from the wider economic benefits of connectivity. But it's not only about infrastructure, or hard infrastructure. As I mentioned, a wide range of policies need to be put in place to improve connectivity. Here we made a small simulation looking at if the border crossing times would be reduced to be in average the same as in Latvia, which is sort of a benchmark in the region in emerging and growing economies. And what we found out that improving border crossings alone would actually provide or bring comparable connectivity benefits with infrastructure improvements. these measures in soft infrastructure, not only border crossings, and we discuss other measures in our report, could be potentially more cost effective than sometimes large, very expensive infrastructure projects that also take a long time to implement and before the actual benefits will emerge. But of course, both should be targeted. A point that I need to mention on when we're benchmarking the performance of the Central Asian logistics and border crossings across the OECD best performance is that we do see improvement in average border crossing times. This is a very positive development thanks to a lot of the improvements that have been made also here in Kazakhstan. However, what we also observe is that the variability around the border crossing times is increasing. And what that means is that it is even more difficult for the shippers to plan their operations effectively if you do not know if the border crossing times will take place in 2 hours or 20 hours time. So while we quite often tend to focus on average border crossing times, we strongly recommend to focus on the variability of the border crossing times because this is crucial for the international shippers to be running efficient operations. Another element highlighting the importance of not only looking at one measure at a time. This graph is just to illustrate that point. If you increase border crossing times, you might actually be affecting the choice of routes from which the shippers will be moving their goods. In our model, we saw quite a lot of traffic flows moving to the Fergana Valley between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan as a result of the improved border crossing times. What does it mean is that when you're planning your infrastructure, you need to take into account that if you improve border crossing, there might be shifts where and when you need to invest for the infrastructure as well. And this brings me to another point, which is an extremely important part of building the analytical capacities in the region, in the countries, to be able to assess these changes and plan infrastructure needs related to other measures, other policies, such as border crossing times that are being improved. So, very brief presentation on some of the high-level findings of the report, and I'd like to conclude for the regional connectivity a few key points. The first thing to say that we also estimate in the report that improved connectivity as a result of the investment, as a result of the border crossings, can boost economic growth by 5 to up to 10% in the region by 2050. That might sound small, given the time frame of 30, 35 years, but it can be very significant in certain parts of the region. So again, when we're talking about average boost of economic growth by 5 to 10%, some of the key corridors, key regions might actually be boosted even much more. So we know that the distance or the fact that countries are landlocked can never be fully eliminated. But what we can do is to compensate those through appropriate important policy measures. In terms of the modal shares, we do see the rail connections being the backbone of the international connectivity of the region. However, we should not forget the road freight. Road freight, especially for intra-regional, the national connectivity, linking those very important domestic consumption production centers to those international corridors. And again, focus should not only be in international connectivity, but also on local connectivity. I can't stress enough on the importance of providing the companies, the firms, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises in the diversifying economy, their access to these corridors to fully benefit from these connectivity improvements. A lot of the focus of the policies is on transit. We should also remember transit is not only benefits, as also mentioned by Vice Minister, and we need to be able to manage the negative outcomes. whether those are in terms of environmental outcomes, in terms of safety outcomes, or in terms of increased funding and financing needs for maintenance of that infrastructure that is provided for the transit. We should also not forget the soft measures. It's easy to focus on infrastructure, large infrastructure project, but those soft measures, and I have to say we've seen a lot of extremely important improvements in the region, such as border crossing, is as important as the transport infrastructure. We do highlight the point that there are bottlenecks in the future, even with the large investments that are planned, and this needs targeted assessment, targeted analysis where and when and what type of infrastructure will be needed. And for that, you need extremely well-educated institutional capacity that is able to plan and make those assessments, especially given the increasing uncertainty we see in the global economy. These uncertainties will really affect where the goods will be moving in the future and where we need to invest. And again, I think there's a strong recommendation to continue to strengthen the regional cooperation, to remove the bottlenecks, not only the infrastructure, but also the non-infrastructure and institutional bottlenecks that exist in the region. And I think this report hopefully serves as basis with the more detailed recommendations on how to move forward and provides some of the answers how to do that. Now, being in Kazakhstan, the report also includes country-specific recommendations and key messages. I wanted to finalize my presentation on a couple of specific findings for Kazakhstan. First, I need to say that a lot has been done in Kazakhstan. Major investments have taken place in capacity of infrastructure around the growth poles, around the local connections. There have been reforms in road and rail sector that have been extremely useful for improving efficiency. The border crossings have been improved significantly. The law on public-private partnership and the creation of the PPP Center are something that are seen as a very positive development. And the implementation of the road asset management systems in the country is something that we applaud Kazakhstan for. But what we do also see that the connectivity will improve as a result of these improvements, but the increased transit flows as a result will be a challenge. There's a need to select projects, not only in terms of transit, but in terms of connectivity. And what this requires is assessment tools, development of assessment tools that really help us to understand better in Kazakhstan how specific projects improve connectivity as well, not only transit. And there are tools, geographical economy, assessment tools that are available in the OECD best practices, and we recommend some of those, and we are very happy to continue this cooperation to provide support to the Kazakhstan government with building these. Transit should also cover its costs. We see very positive development in terms of the road charges. If I've understood correctly, by 2020, 6,500 kilometers of roads will be charged in Kazakhstan. But road pricing is needed to cover the full cost of transit. Not only the maintenance cost, but also the investment cost and environmental and safety cost. Because this funding can be used to further improve this infrastructure, which, even though might increase the cost for transit, will improve the overall efficiency of the transit system, attracting, again, more transit. There's a growing role of private finance in infrastructure, and I mentioned some of the developments that Kazakhstan has already made on that. We recommend that the value for money should be the primary motive and the guiding principle for involving private finance. And the PPP model should be targeted to specific infrastructure projects. The PPP Center that has been developed could be an opportunity to set national guidelines and build capacity on setting those guidelines when and where for what type of project public-private partnership could be used. Of course, focusing on the fact that it is important that the private sector takes the demand risk for these projects. As I mentioned before, increasing connectivity is a very positive trend, but the last mile connectivity in our assessment is a growing challenge. And we strongly recommend focusing on that element of the connectivity. For that, a consistent project selection tools and methods can help to identify what type of interventions should be made. The asset management system that has been put in place is a very useful element to identify where critical infrastructure interventions need to be taking place. But like in many other countries, there's quite often a lack of disparity between the asset management information and the decision making. And what is needed, the asset management system should be clearly linked to decision making and financing of infrastructure, because then the interventions will be targeted where the needs are the biggest. There's a need, I mentioned already before, on focus on intermodality, increasing and perhaps considering consolidating logistics terminals to improve the efficiency of those several terminals that exist. And this could be a way to stimulate also new specialized logistics services that we do see are lacking at the moment in the country. This is, as I mentioned before, extremely important for the diversification of economy, as a result of which the need for this type of specified logistic services is growing. And all this requires better data, it requires new tools, it requires transport forecast models, assessment and appraisal methods that are not necessarily always available at the institutions. So one of our strong recommendations is to create a transport observatory in Kazakhstan that could take role in first starting from collecting data, collecting crucial information, where the flows are taking place, what are the infrastructure that we have today, and then perhaps moving and widening this experience to building capacity in forecast modeling, in assessment tools, etc., that can be helpful for the government in their decision making. We have worked with other emerging economies such as Chile and Mexico and supported them in building this type of an observatory, and these have been, in our view, very successful examples where better data has led to better transport policies. So I leave with that, and thank you very much for your attention. And I think I have the one more slide. Please go to the website and have a look at the report. I leave it here for you. You can take a photo, and it's freely downloadable both in Russian and English, the report here presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Большое
Presentation of a report that I hope all of you will take up and look more closely at. You mentioned the environmental dimension, so I just want to state that at noon today, across the way in the Hilton in which hall, Kumi? In the Singapore room, there will be a session devoted to financing sustainable infrastructures. An extremely important issue with as much construction that's going on. We must get it right from the perspective of sustainability, or we will lock ourselves into infrastructure solutions that are extremely bad for future generations. So I think there'll be a fascinating follow-on after this session. But right now, I'd like to open the floor again. Все еще у нас время для обсуждения, вопросы, комментарии.
So now we have some time for questions and comments. If any, please, you are welcome. Значит, я
Thank you very much for a perfect presentation of the perfect report. My question relates to the border crossings on the Russia-Kazakhstan border and on the data. Could you say how did you get data on the time and the cost of border crossing on that direction? And did you capture the effect of the customs union, which happened starting from 2011, thanks to the elimination of the customs control at the border, which made it easier to cross the border for road traffic, for trucks? And if you have captured this effect, how substantial was it compared, for example, to the road infrastructure quality? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the question.
I-
Compliments for the perfect report. I hope it's not a perfect yet. We can still improve it, I hope. Just in terms of the data, we have used the data from Asian Development Bank, the Carrot Corridor, especially the Corridor Performance Measurement and Monitoring Program, which collects a lot of these data on a yearly basis. I think in terms of the customs union, we were not able to fully assess the impact, and we did not focus so much on that question, but we do see improved border crossing times, which is probably due to that as well. Identifying the causality between the customs union, the other improvements, etc., is somewhat difficult. That would require another study. But like I said before, I think one of the things that we do see in case of Kazakhstan as well is the increase in the variability of those border crossing times. So, and a lot of that, I cannot speak about specific border crossings, but it's actually interesting to see that in some of these, it is because of queuing. It's not so much the border crossing process, but it's the queuing time, it's the waiting times and loading and unloading times that take the bulk of the border crossing procedure when you look at it as a whole. So we focus a lot on the process side, and quite often we tend to forget that the trucks have to come to the border crossing somewhere, they have to wait somewhere if there's a queue, and given the variability and uncertainty over the border crossing time, you tend to come early if possible to make sure that you get to the point of time when you're supposed to cross the border. And so there are these elements that I think would require still further studying, but definitely an element that we identified is one of the challenges still in the region.
Others, please, don't be shy. На русском, на английском, как вам удобнее.
Я вот хотел бы добавить, если...
Yeah, I would like to add, with the Russian Federation, who is our big neighbor, we are working very actively within the customs union, and as it has been mentioned in the report, the focus in this report is made on carriage within Central Asia. 6 international transport road corridors go through territory of Kazakhstan, apart from railroad and others. From among 6 international transport corridors, corridor Western Europe, Western China is of great importance, which unites Linyang port in China through Khargos eastern gates, come here to Kazakhstan, and then go through the western part, through Aktobe to Russia. And meanwhile, this corridor hasn't been completed fully. This issue being raised at the level of Intergovernmental Council because precise definition of the corridor in Russia up to St. Petersburg have not been articulated and developed. That's why, taking this chance, I would like to urge our guest from St. Petersburg University raise this issue when he's back at home. This is one route, one belt, one route, and our forwarding companies and sea transportation, they use this corridor and will be using this corridor, and this is one of our, well, opportunities and challenges. Any other? I don't think that we have responded to all types of questions, but any comments, remarks?
Sorry. There is such a barrier in the transportation or additional cost as a road bribery. And in Central Asia, it happens. Did you capture this source of additional cost of transportation, and how important did you see it? Thank you.
If I got the right word, bribery, so the informal costs. Yes, we in economic terms, I suppose. We did not account that in the model. We don't have clear idea of, because they differ by type of mode, type of route, which route you're taking. But we do discuss that in some extent in the report, and we do identify it as one of the challenges in the region. And it's linked to the more broader question of driver safety, on facilities that are also around this for the truck drivers, etc. So it becomes a question of a broader question. It is, of course, about reinforcement. It's about how do we manage this bribery, and how do we manage the so-called informal costs. But it also becomes a matter of providing the truck drivers the necessary infrastructure for rest places, safe rest places, fueling stations, and waiting places where they can wait for the border crossing, etc., etc., etc. So there are several elements that, of course, none of the models in the world can take into account all of that, but it's important to keep in mind those and keep discussing those. So we do cover that discussion in the report as well.
Thank you. And now, in fact,
Just a moment.
Oh, no.
Но я хочу сказать, что
Would like to say that these questions, corruption, bribery, they are relevant not only to Central Asia, maybe they are also valid for all CIS countries, also for Russia. That's why if you want to calculate cost of the good, we in Central Asia probably are not, do not look as bad, that bad as compared to other countries. And we are doing something. What we are doing, yes, there are such facts, we admit that. Maybe in Kazakhstan and other Central Asian countries, as it has been mentioned. But today we are studying the experience, human factor, and automated systems in border crossing points just to eliminate human factor. We are working at this. But as for the fact that we are in customs union, some legal acts, some regulations shall be amended in order to combat this phenomenon. Of course, we have built big infrastructure, big roads, and we need to look after our roads. We need to value them, and that's why we are to work not only in order to eliminate human factor, but we are to look after the safety of our roads and ensure that we have modern, good infrastructure at the end of the day. Ну, поскольку
a little bit and put my boss on the spot. Andreas Schall is Director of Global Relations, so he looks after all of the OECD's strategic relationships with countries that are not or not yet members of the OECD. And so I was going to ask Andreas to zoom out a little bit and put the discussion of Central Asia into a wider global context.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator. When I learned something in my diplomatic career, it's that if you answer a difficult question, you don't answer it, you start by a joke. So what I'm going to do is take up first an image or a fantasy Minister of Economy, our friend Ruslan Dalenov has put on the table, and link it to the transport question, also link it to the question, what does it mean in terms of transit and in terms of connectivity. He had this image or this picture about a hamburger produced in the US and delivered in 24 hours to China. And I think it's not about, when we speak about transport or connectivity, it's not necessarily only about the road, which makes it possible that a Peking duck is delivered in 15 or 20 hours to a Paris restaurant. It's not about the question that my friends Arnaud and Luc, who are sitting over there, can eat a good besh barmak in Paris, which was produced in Astana 15 hours before. It's really about the question about how you integrate regionally with transport and with connectivity, how you integrate the Kazakh economy into the global economy, how you benefit from an international investor, link it, as we discussed before, with SME companies which kind of are interacting with this international investor, and then use the transport infrastructure or be linked to this transport infrastructure. This is about connectivity, and that's why we're putting so much emphasis in this report also on the question about trade policies and about, as the professor from St. Petersburg asked, about cross-the-border measures, about kind of how can we reduce the transaction costs in terms of the whole connectivity story. So what I wanted to say, it requires much more fantasy when we speak about infrastructure, about roads, and the vice ministers said also so to have a more integrated concept around infrastructure, to link it to trade policy, to economic policies, even to digital and skills policies, to have a more comprehensive package. Second point, and now I'm going to answer your question. Of course, there's a current in many countries in the surroundings of Kazakhstan, in the outskirts of Kazakhstan, I would say, are currently advancing big infrastructure initiatives to better link Asia, Southeast Asia with Central Asia, Asia with Europe. And these are all very promising initiatives to a certain extent. But we also, and I think this is the Chinese Belt and Road, it's the European Connectivity Initiative, it's the Australian, Indian, Japanese, Indo-Pacific. And the question, and what's all common in this infrastructure initiative, is that they are not only infrastructure initiatives, but they also need to be filled with the content for this infrastructure, and they need to kind of be filled also with an appropriate governance in terms of the use of international standards, and that's where the OECD is offering a partnership to countries at the, I wouldn't say at the receiving end, but of countries which are providing this infrastructure to see whether we can apply the best standards in public procurement of the projects, whether we can provide the best standards for anti-corruption, whether we can best provide the best standards in the governance of this infrastructure, in the in the costs in the transit costs, for example. And there, the Vice Minister mentioned also the link to sustainability, to environmental costs, and this is a conversation we have in 1 hour for now. So there are a number of things which are linked not only to, it's not only about building a road, building a railway, it's about having a more comprehensive package around this infrastructure. And this is how I want to answer your question about putting the thing into a more global perspective also. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. A few minutes, there's somebody, yeah? Derek?
Yes, if I may just add and follow up on, I think Andreas had a very, very good point on that. And to me, the connectivity is a question of friction. And at the end of the day, when we talk about cost as an economist, but what it really essentially is about the friction in the flow of people and goods. And where that friction takes place is typically in interfaces. Whenever some kind of an interface is in the system, whether it is a border crossing, that's the friction point, whether it's actually the product procedure where you're handing over documents and going through them, that's a friction. Bribery, corruption is a friction in the system, but it's also the friction between the ports and the hinterland, between road and rail, and the focusing on removing that friction in that system, I think, can be very, very useful to improve the connectivity. And just in terms of the question, going back to that, what we see is one of the things in the road sector specifically in the region is that, and going back what Andreas, you said about governance and regulation and how do we do that, a lot of the enforcement does take place for international traffic. But it's the domestic traffic that never goes to the border crossing places where that enforcement takes place that are outside of that enforcement. So there are this kind of imbalances in the system as well that need to be covered. But again, I would really much focus on removing the friction from the system, and that way the connectivity will improve.
Thank you, Jari. Perhaps time for 1 or 2 more short questions or comments if there are some late entrants at the starting gate. If not, если вот нет желающих еще вот задать.
Volunteers to ask questions, then probably at this point, we are to finish 2 hours and a half without coffee break, without coffee in the morning. So we are working as Stakhanov, who was hero of the communist labor. And I would like to express gratitude to the government of Kazakhstan and to all my colleagues who participated in today's session. The questions which we are discussing are very important, not only for the future of Kazakhstan, but for the future of the whole region. And I'm very glad when I'm in Nur-sultan and when I was in Astana, that our colleagues, the government, administration, they understood very well the regional concept, because there won't be rich Kazakhstan without prospering Central Asia. Rich Kazakhstan with poor neighbors are probably not possible. And this is regional economy, market. That's why we understand why we are supported in the regional context. And discussion of these questions will continue. And at 12 at noon, there will be continuation in Hilton Hotel. I will speak on sustainable infrastructure. I express gratitude for your attention, for presence. And just I would like to note that we'll be discussing these questions during the week of OECD in Eurasia, which will take place at the beginning of the next year in March in Georgia, in Tiflis. it will be the second time in the region. The first time was in 2017. It was in Almaty. It was very successful with the help of Kazakhstan. Now I'm very much pleased to invite all of you, if you have such chance, to come to Tbilisi. Thank you very much.